Arizona Territory. September 1879. The baby's cry cut through the night like a blade, sharp and thin, echoing off dry wooden beams and the wide silence of the plain. Gideon Foster reined in his horse, boots hitting the earth just outside the abandoned barn nestled against the red rock bluff. The moon hung low, casting silver over the dry scrub and casting long shadows between the slats of the structure. He had not expected anyone out here. This land was 2 days' ride from the nearest town. The barn was old, almost forgotten, left behind when the ranchers moved on. But there it was again, soft, desperate, a baby's wail. Gideon stepped forward, pushing the creaking door open with one hand, the other resting on the butt of his Colt. Inside, hay dust lingered in the air and moonlight spilled through the gaps in the roof. He saw her almost at once. She was curled in the far corner, her dress torn at the hem, one sleeve ripped, hair matted with sweat and dust, her arms wrapped tight around a tiny bundled figure. The baby's face was red from crying, but the mother, she was still, too still. Gideon's voice came quiet but firm. "Ma'am?" She flinched, tightening her grip on the baby and inching back until her spine hit the wall. Her eyes were wide, scared, but not weak. They met his, holding there. "I won't hurt you," he said, stepping in slow. "Name's Gideon Foster. I live out west of here. Heard the baby." She hesitated, licking cracked lips. "Please," she whispered, "do not take her. I am not here to take anything." His voice softened. "You all right?" "No," she said, and then the strength seemed to drain from her. Her shoulders dropped. "I have not eaten in 2 days. There is no water." She needs. Gideon was already moving. He unhooked his canteen, stepping slow so not to spook her, and offered it. She stared at it like it might bite, then reached with trembling fingers. She drank first, then tilted it carefully to the baby's lips. "Thank you," she breathed. "What is your name?" Gideon asked, crouching a few feet away. "Georgia Whitlow," she said, voice tired. "My baby's name is Tessa." Gideon nodded. "How long you been out here?" "Since yesterday morning. I walked until my legs gave out. I had no place else to go." "Where's your husband?" Her jaw tightened. She looked away. "Gone. He waited. He left me outside of Winslow. Said he was going for supplies. Never came back. I waited 3 days. Then I walked." Gideon's fists clenched. "You were left out there with a baby?" She nodded, staring down at the child now asleep against her chest. "Hell," Gideon muttered under his breath. "I thought maybe someone would find us. But no one came. I found this place by accident." "You got family?" "None that would take me in," she said. "Not after this." Gideon looked at her, really looked. She was young, maybe 22. Her hands were blistered, her dress threadbare. But her spine stayed straight. There was a quiet strength in her, the kind that only came from hardship. "I cannot stay here," she said softly. "But I do not know where else to go." "Well," he said, standing, "you are coming with me." She blinked. "What?" "I got a cabin 5 miles west. You and the baby, you will be safe there. I got food, water." "I cannot," she started, but he raised a hand. "You can. You will. This place will not hold up another night, not with that baby." Georgia looked down at Tessa, then back at him. Her eyes were wet, but she nodded. Took time to get her on the horse. She was weak, legs shaking, but she held the baby tight as Gideon helped her into the saddle. Then he climbed up behind them, steadying her with one arm as they rode into the night. They reached the cabin just before dawn. A low cedar-built structure nestled into the slope of a hill. Gideon helped her inside, lit the lamp, laid out blankets by the hearth. He handed her bread and a jar of preserves, and she ate like she had not tasted food in weeks. Tessa slept in a basket lined with wool. Georgia barely took her eyes off the child as Gideon stoked the fire. "You do not even know me," she said quietly, watching him. "No," he agreed, setting aside the poker. "But I know what it looks like when someone is left to die. And I do not leave people behind." She looked at him for a long time, silent. That night, Georgia lay curled on the floor near the fire, Tessa beside her. Gideon sat in the rocker, watching the flames. Every so often his eyes drifted to the two of them. The barn had been a place of fear. But here, in the quiet of his home, something else stirred. Not just pity. Not just duty. Something deeper. He had found more than a stranger out there. And he was not about to let her go. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, its light catching on the dry grass and low mesquite outside the cabin, Georgia was already awake. She sat on the edge of the woven rug, knees drawn up, her dress patched with last night's warmth. She hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind outside had kept her half listening. She watched the baby's small chest rise and fall in the basket nearby, lullabied by the hush of dawn. Gideon had stepped outside a while before, boots crunching on the packed earth. She hadn't asked where he was going, and he hadn't offered. Still, she'd noticed he'd pulled the door shut with care, as if mindful of the draft. It was a small thing, but it held weight. When he returned, his arms were full a dry bundle of mesquite wood, and something wrapped in cloth slung over one shoulder. He set the wood beside the hearth with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 mornings before, then laid the cloth bundle on the table. "I brought eggs," he said without looking at her. Hen's been stubborn, but she finally gave up for. Georgia stood slowly. Her knees ached from sleeping on the floor, but she didn't mention it. "I can cook," she said, voice hoarse from the night. "If you've got a pan." He nodded toward a cabinet near the hearth. "Iron skillet, second shelf. Bacon's in the tin. You'll have to slice it yourself." She moved without hesitation, unwrapping the eggs with care. Her hands shook only a little. She found the knife, the skillet, the bacon cured and wrapped in waxed muslin. The sizzle of meat on hot iron filled the room, mixing with wood smoke. Gideon leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "You handle yourself well in a kitchen. I worked in one once. Before I married," she said, not meeting his gaze. He didn't press. The silence between them now wasn't stiff. It had room in it. "I'll patch that sleeve today," he said after a moment. Needles in the drawer. Threads mostly brown and blue. She glanced at the torn fabric near her shoulder. "I appreciate it." He stepped forward, crouched by the hearth, and stirred the fire back to life. "You planning to stay long?" "I don't know," she said quietly. "I didn't plan anything after yesterday." He looked up at her. "You don't need to figure it all at once." She nodded, eyes lingering on the flames. "You live alone here?" "I do." "No family nearby?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." She didn't ask more. The bacon popped in the pan, and she turned the slices with practiced flicks. The baby stirred as the smell deepened, her tiny fists stretching upward. Georgia paused, wiped her hands on a cloth, and lifted Tessa gently. "She'll need something soon," Georgia murmured, rocking her lightly. "I used to have milk, but it's been near 3 days." "I've got a goat," Gideon replied. "Not much, but enough. I'll show you how to warm it on the stove." She looked at him, really looked, the way one does when they're trying to decide if kindness is real or temporary. He met her gaze and held it. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took the skillet from her hands and moved it off the heat. "Because you needed someone to," he said finally. "And because I've been alone for a long time." She shifted the baby on her hip. "That's not the same as trusting a stranger." "No," he agreed. "But it's a place to start." She turned toward the window. The sky beyond was pale gold now, the desert stretching wide and quiet around them. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. "I'll help while I'm here," she said. "Chores, cleaning. I know how to keep a place." "I won't stop you," he replied, and there was a flicker of something like warmth in his voice. They ate at the small table, heads bowed over tin plates, the baby tucked into the crook of Georgia's arm. The room was quiet but not heavy. When Georgia reached for a slice of bread, Gideon passed it without a word. When she stood to clean the skillet, he didn't tell her to sit. He only gathered the wood and stepped back outside, leaving the door wide enough to let the air move through. She watched him from the window as he chopped a short stack of cedar logs, his movements measured and sure. He didn't glance up even when she leaned her forehead against the glass. She didn't expect him to. Still, the quiet between them felt less like silence and more like something beginning to settle. By early afternoon, the wind had picked up out of the south, warm and dry, curling dust along the path behind the cabin. Georgia stood near the side of the house, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a tin basin balanced on the stump beside her. The rhythm of scrubbing Gideon's shirts against the washboard was steady, unhurried. Her hands stung with the lye soap, but she didn't mind. It was good to have something to do, something that made the day move forward. Inside, Tessa slept in the cradle Gideon had carried down from the loft, smoothed with a clean blanket Georgia had stitched from an old grain sack. The baby hadn't fussed much since morning. She took the goat's milk well enough, and her cheeks had started to pink up again. Gideon was down by the fence line with spade in hand, turning up the hard soil. Georgia watched him through the trees. He moved like someone used to labor, shoulders solid beneath a faded work shirt, the back of his neck brown from years in the sun. He didn't glance up, but she knew he was aware of her there, same as she was aware of him. She wrung out the last shirt and hung it beside the others on the line. The air smelled of cedar, dust, and soap. "Ground stubborn," Gideon said as he approached, spade slung across one shoulder. "Not much'll grow, but I figure beans and squash might take come spring." "I could help," Georgia offered, brushing damp hair from her brow. "If you've got seed." "I do. Not much. Some I traded for last season." She nodded, then turned her gaze toward the hills beyond. "We had a garden once. Back in Missouri. My father kept onions and tobacco mostly. My mother liked lilacs, but they never took to the soil." "You miss it." "Not the place. Just the parts that felt like home." Gideon leaned against the porch rail, arms folded. "What made it feel that way?" She hesitated, then answered, "The sound of the kettle in the morning. My mother's boots by the door. Knowing someone would see me if I didn't come in by dusk." He shifted his weight. "Folks need to be seen." Georgia tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I stopped expecting it from anyone but Tessa." He didn't speak for a moment, then said, "I see you." She looked over, eyes steady. "Why does that matter to you?" "Because you're here now," he said. "And I don't like emptiness where it doesn't belong." She looked down, studying the dry earth beneath her feet. "I was starting to believe that's all there was left." "You were wrong." The wind picked up again, tugging at the laundry on the line. Georgia stepped forward, catching a corner of one of the shirts before it twisted loose. He moved to help, tying the cloth down with practiced knots. When their hands brushed, she didn't pull away. "I don't know what comes next," she said quietly. "Neither do I," he answered. "But you're not facing it alone." She held his gaze, something unspoken flickering between them, quiet but sure. Inside the cabin, the baby stirred. Georgia turned toward the door, but paused. "Would you sit with us a while this evening?" she asked. "After supper." "I'd like that." She stepped inside and he watched her go, the screen door closing softly behind her. When she returned to the porch later, a wool shawl over her shoulders and the baby cradled against her chest, Gideon was already there, a tin cup of coffee in hand, the rocking chair creaking beneath him. She settled onto the bench nearby, Tessa curled into sleep. They didn't speak much as dusk fell. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It held the shape of something being built slowly, carefully, like a fence line laid along uncertain ground. And for the first time since she'd fled the road outside Winslow, Georgia didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she might be running toward. Late afternoon light slanted through the cottonwoods behind the cabin, casting long shadows across the yard where Georgia knelt beside a shallow trench, her palms dusted with soil. She pressed a row of beans into the earth, one by one, careful in her spacing. The warmth of the sun clung to her back, but the breeze off the hills made the work bearable. Gideon stood a few yards off, mending a broken rail along the corral that circled his lone mare. The rhythmic clink of hammer to nail punctuated the quiet, but neither of them spoke. The silence was companionable. After setting the last seed, Georgia sat back on her heels, brushing her hands on her skirt. Do you keep any books? He set the hammer down and turned. Couple. Nothing worth boasting. Bible, a ledger, one journal I never finished. Would you mind if I read? She asked, rising. Long as you don't judge the handwriting. She smiled, subtle and quick, then walked toward the cabin. Inside, Tessa lay wrapped in a quilt near the hearth, eyes half-lidded but alert. Georgia bent to stroke her cheek, then crossed to the shelf beside the table. 3 books leaned crookedly on the plank. She chose the smallest one, its cover worn smooth, and carried it out with her. Back on the porch, she eased into the bench and opened the journal. The first page was dated 3 years earlier. The handwriting was firm, though some words leaned into the margins like they couldn't be contained. You wrote this? She asked without lifting her eyes. I tried to. Winter got long that year. Needed something to keep the mind sharp. She flipped a few pages. You write about the land, and the sky, and the sound of snow against the roof. Her voice softened. There's a line in here about silence not being empty. He nodded once, eyes on the horizon. I meant it when I wrote it. She traced the edge of the page with her thumb. It doesn't feel empty here. That's the idea. She set the book aside, folding her hands in her lap. How long did you serve? He didn't answer right away. 6 years. Cavalry out of Fort Lowell. Road scout most of it. Desert campaigns? Some. Mostly escort work. Supply trains. I got out after my brother didn't come back from a patrol near the San Pedro. She didn't reach for sympathy, just listened. Was he older? Younger by 2 years. Too eager. Thought war made men. He was wrong about that. I'm sorry, she said, her tone even. I carried his boots home to my father, Gideon added. That was the last time I went east. They fell quiet again. The sun slipped lower, brushing the tops of the brush with gold. I almost didn't leave that wagon outside Winslow, Georgia said, her voice low. I sat there until the second evening. He'd taken the rifle and one of the canteens. I told myself he'd come back. What changed your mind? Tessa. She looked toward the cradle through the open door. She stopped crying. Just stared up at me like she was waiting. Sometimes that's all it takes, Gideon said. One pair of eyes asking you to move. She nodded. I walked from sunup to past dusk. Found that barn when I couldn't go any farther. If you hadn't come. I did. She turned toward him slowly. I'm not sure I understand you yet. You don't have to, he said. Understanding comes later. Sometimes it starts with choosing not to leave. She watched him for a moment, then stood and went inside, returning with Tessa bundled in her arms. The baby blinked against the light, then nestled into her mother's chest. Georgia looked at the porch, then at the empty rocker. Would you? He rose and took the child with careful hands, easing into the chair. His hold was awkward at first, but Tessa settled quickly, tiny fingers curling against his vest. She doesn't cry with you, Georgia said, surprised. She knows her mother is near. Georgia leaned against the post, arms folded. You don't speak like a man who's lived alone. I've had time to think. The sun dipped below the hills, the shadows lengthening. Tessa breathed evenly against his chest. Georgia's voice came quiet. If I stayed, would you want that? I already do. She didn't speak again. Instead, she stepped forward and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, her hand resting lightly against his knee. And in the hush between dusk and dark, Gideon shifted his hand until it covered hers. She didn't move it away. The rain started just before dawn, a soft pattering against the cedar roof that grew steadier with each hour. Georgia stood at the window, one hand resting lightly against the frame, watching the steady fall turn the dust to damp clay. The sky was a low, unbroken gray, the kind that promised to linger. Behind her, Gideon added another log to the fire, the warmth pushing back the chill that had crept in overnight. Tessa lay swaddled in a quilt near the hearth, her eyes following the flicker of flame, content in the quiet. Georgia turned from the window. Will the road hold through this? He shook his head. Not for wagons. The wash floods quick. Best we stay put until it passes. She nodded and crossed to the table where she set to work cleaning the last of the dried beans they'd shelled the day before. Her movements were unhurried, precise. Gideon watched her for a moment, then reached for the worn deck of cards tucked on the shelf near the stove. "Ever play 7-Up?" he asked, settling opposite her. She met his eyes, her expression unreadable for a breath. "Then Saturday my father used to deal. Said it was the only game where honesty cost you more than cheating." Gideon chuckled low. "Depends who you're playing with." They passed the morning in ease, the cards laying down a rhythm between them. She won more hands than he did, though he never said so out loud. After the third game, she leaned back, eyes narrowed. "You let me take that last one? I don't see the use in lying." She tilted her head. "You're not quite what I expected." "And what did you expect?" "Someone harder," she said. "Someone who'd have nothing left to give." Gideon set the cards aside. "I had years like that. Things turned quiet and I stayed with it. But quiet's not the same as hollow." Georgia reached for the kettle, poured 2 cups. She set his in front of him, then rested her hand on the tabletop. He didn't take her hand, not yet, but he looked at it like it belonged there. "Would you be willing to teach me?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. "The land," she said. "How you keep it. The tools. I want to learn it proper." "You already know more than you think," he said. "But I'll show you what I can." They spent the rest of the day inside, the rain unrelenting. Georgia patched the baby's blanket with a scrap of flour sack linen, while Gideon carved a handle for the hoe that had split 2 weeks earlier. Tessa dozed and stirred, fed and fussed, and all the while the cabin held the shape of something steady. That evening, Georgia stood by the hearth, brushing the last knots from her hair. Gideon poured water into the basin, then stepped aside so she could wash. She looked at him, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, and something in her expression shifted, no longer guarded, but quiet and open. "Do you ever think on what it means to belong somewhere?" she asked. He dried his hands on a cloth. "I used to. Gave up on it after a while. I think I might be starting to remember." He stepped toward her, slow and sure. "You don't have to earn that here." Her eyes didn't leave his. "I don't know how to be loved without earning it." "You don't need to know," he said. "You just need to stay." She reached for his hand, and this time he took hers. Their fingers laced together, nothing rushed, nothing uncertain. That night, she didn't lay her quilt on the floor. When Gideon pulled back the cover on his bed, she stepped beside him, Tessa already asleep in the cradle nearby. No words passed between them, only the quiet understanding of 2 people choosing the same life. The days that followed settled into rhythm. Georgia took to the goats, learned the temper of each one by name. Gideon showed her how to mend fence posts with wire he'd bartered for the previous year. They planted another row of beans and a patch of early corn. She wrote letters she never sent, folded carefully and kept in a box beneath the bed. He added new pages to the journal she'd once read aloud from, now with her handwriting beside his. One afternoon, 2 weeks after the rain, Gideon hitched the mare to the cart and they rode into town. Georgia carried Tessa close, wrapped in a hand-sewn sling. The general storekeeper eyed them a little too long, but said nothing. When asked, Gideon introduced her plainly. "This is Georgia Foster," he said. "My wife." She didn't flinch. She only turned, kissed the baby's brow, and smiled. They married under the cottonwoods behind the cabin, with the wind threading through the branches and the ground dry and warm beneath their feet. Gideon carved a ring from a strip of antler and tied it with rawhide. She wore it always. They never spoke again of the road outside Winslow. It had no place in the life they built. The past stayed behind them where it belonged. Tessa took her first steps between the rows of squash, her hands reaching for Gideon's belt and George's apron hem. She grew with the seasons, steady, strong. A girl who laughed loud and loved the soil. Years passed. The cabin grew by 2 rooms. The corral held more than 1 mare. The garden fed not just them, but neighbors passing through. And every night, after the chores were done and the child tucked in, Georgia would sit on the porch beside Gideon. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But always they touched hand resting on knee, shoulder against arm. A quiet love, not spoken, but lived. What they had was not sudden nor easy. It was earned, shaped by trust and time. And it held. Through storm and sun, through grief remembered and joy made daily. They stayed. Together. Always.